Good morning, friends, and welcome to this special session of the EU-US-India trilateral, which we've been hosting since yesterday afternoon. Special because this session was actually intended as in our planning. Things never work out as per our plans, but we intended this to be the inaugural session to kick off this trilateral forum. But then Minister Jayant Sinha, being Minister Jayant Sinha and extremely busy, we could not find a time slot yesterday. He's been having such a full diary, and why not? Only yesterday he was flagging off the UDAN scheme with the Prime Minister from Shimla, which is basically India's great adventure in connectivity to regions which have hitherto been unconnected. It's a great ambitious venture, and it has taken off as of yesterday. This is a scheme which the minister helped nurture and pilot, and congratulations, sir, for the scheme. And this is part of, I think, the government's ambitions to not only ensure that India's aviation capacity and infrastructure keep pace with India's growth ambitions, but actually give it much greater impetus and momentum in the years to come. So actually, sir, I dare say that you're joining us today rather than yesterday is a blessing in disguise. And I'll tell you why. Because yesterday we witnessed some very intense discussions on the state of the Indian economy, a lot on the India story. There were a lot of questions and agitated discussions.
Who spoke yesterday?
Yesterday there were panels. So there were a number of speakers who came, and there were lots of questions which were asked back and forth. We discussed everything. We even did a post-mortem of demonetization, as expected. Then there was something on the GST bill which is coming up. And the larger story about India's narrative, the real narrative about India's growth story. Where is India headed? What is it doing? What are the government's ambitions? So you are absolutely the right person whom we have caught hold of today to lead us through this part. So I look forward to your oration. We'll do it for about 20-25 minutes, and then open the house for any questions. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joshi, and a very good morning to all of you. It's indeed a pleasure to know that you've had a series of intense and heated discussions in the last day or so, thinking about what is happening in India with respect to our economic growth, our reform story, and what some of the major friction points are, some of the major challenges are. And just building on that, and knowing that all of you are very sophisticated observers of the political economy, I thought it might be interesting to tell you really what is animating the government. What is it that really shapes our approach? What is the single most overarching item on our agenda that then drives a lot of our policy? So I thought I could start that way, and then you'll see as I unpack that theme, you'll see how a lot of things that seem not to be so clear kind of fall into place. And I think that gives a great coherence to our reforms work, but for all of us as politicians, much more importantly, that provides real clarity in terms of our political messaging, which clearly, as you've been seeing from the latest election results, have proven to be quite powerful. So that's really what I want to help you understand a little bit. And obviously, as Mr. Joshi was saying, I'll speak for about 15 or 20 minutes, and I really want to give you all an opportunity to then drill me or throw rocks at me or ask me any tough questions you want, because I have a great deal of confidence that as you understand how the pieces fit together, a lot of the concerns you might have will be dispelled. Now, to really understand what drives the government, you have to come back to the slogan that we won the 2014 election on, and which we have consistently been emphasizing in all the other elections thereafter. And that slogan is Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. That is the overarching agenda for us. And what that really means, that's of course in Hindi, and what that really means is that we are with everyone, we want everyone to progress and develop. It's a development-oriented message. And when we say sabka, when we say everyone in India, we don't mean the people in this room. We don't even mean most of the people living in Delhi. Because 99.9% of India is not this group of people, or the people living in South Mumbai, or the people living in Central Delhi, or the people living in Bangalore South. When we say sabka, when we say everyone, we mean the 99.9% of Indians living in slums, living in shanties, living in villages, living in little towns scattered around the countryside. Their needs, their aspirations, their hopes, their fears are what drive us. And of course, they're the people who vote as well. So it makes perfect sense. And so that's what we really pay attention to. And when we say sabka saath, sabka vikas, those are the people we are really concentrating on. And we made these intentions very clear, not just during the election, but as soon as our government was being formed. And if you have a chance, and if you can particularly get this in translation, you should see the Prime Minister's speech on May the 20th, 2014, that he gave in the Central Hall of Parliament. It's a brilliant, fantastic speech, fantastic. It was my first time as an elected MP, Member of Parliament, to be sitting in the Central Hall of Parliament, which is a very grand and august chamber. And around us are the portraits of all the great founding fathers of India. And in that Central Hall of Parliament, the Prime Minister gave an absolutely brilliant speech. And what he said in that speech is that this is a government, the government that's been voted to power with a single party majority for the first time in 30 years, and the first political party that's a non-Congress party to have got a single party majority. This government, Prime Minister Modi's government, is a government dedicated to the poor. It is a government dedicated to the poor. Sabka saath, sabka vikas. When we meet everyone, when we mean everyone, we mean essentially the poor. That's 95% of India. Some very few Indian families actually have any income security and have steady jobs. Very, very few Indians. Maybe 5% of Indian families, I don't have the exact number, but 5 or 10% of Indian families probably have a steady job. So you can imagine how 95% of India lives. They're very poor and they feel incredibly poor. So when we say we are a government dedicated to the poor, we're a government dedicated to India, because that's the vast majority of Indians. Now, if we are a government that's serving the poor, that's dedicated to the poor, the first priority for us has to be economic growth. We have to deliver economic growth. Economic history shows clearly that only those countries that are able to sustain high economic growth for long periods of time, 7 to 8% GDP growth for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, it's only if you can sustain that kind of growth for a long period of time can you actually eliminate poverty. And so for us, the first priority is economic growth. But to achieve economic growth, we know, and again, this is what economic history has shown us, that we have to focus on the supply side. That unless we build the productive capacity of this economy, we are not going to have high economic growth, we are not going to be able to generate the tax resources, we are not going to be able to generate the jobs, we are not going to be able to generate the wealth to eliminate and end poverty. So we have to build the productive capacity of India's economy. And to build the productive capacity of our economy, we need to build up our hard assets and our soft assets. What are our hard assets? It's the roads, the highways, the bridges, the railways, the airports. We've got to build the hard infrastructure. But equally, we have to build our soft assets, the skills of our people, our judicial system, our innovation ecosystem, our bureaucracy. Unless we strengthen and reform all of our soft assets, we are not going to build the productive capacity of the economy. The hard assets and the soft assets, that's how we build the productive capacity of the economy. As we build the productive capacity of the economy, we can sustain high economic growth for decades, and that's what we need to end poverty. So high economic growth is our number one priority. Now, Even as we are focused on high economic growth, we think a great deal about how do we make our poor better off? How do we enable them to live lives of dignity? And here we differ greatly from our opposition. Here we differ greatly from our political opponents. Because while they have pursued policies of entitlement, we have made it very clear that our policies are of empowerment, not entitlement. We want to empower the poor. And that's the vast majority of India. That's what I'm trying to say. 95% of India, we want to empower them. We don't want to give them entitlement. So how do we empower them? How do our policies, therefore, differ from those of our political opponents? Well, we think giving everybody a bank account and everybody a toilet and everybody a no collateral loan is a way of giving them the tools and the opportunities and the resources they need to improve their lives. Giving a poor villager a toilet is a tremendously important way of improving their life. Because they have better sanitation, they have lower disease burden, the women have dignity. That's why giving them a toilet and a bank account is an empowering thing. Giving a poor family a gas stove so that they don't have to spend 2 to 3 hours a day in the forest looking for fuel wood is an empowering thing. When we cut the smoke burden that exists inside a poor household, where people are using forest wood to cook their food, their daily food, and we reduce the disease burden because they're not inhaling 200 cigarettes a day, that is empowerment. And those are the things we've focused on. A bank account, a toilet, a gas stove. This is how we improve their lives. Giving them the skills so that they can get a better job. And so our policies are focused on empowerment, not entitlement. And we are building an entire social security platform so that everybody is guaranteed a certain basic minimum of support from the government on a conditional basis. Now, you could argue food security. Food security. 86% of people in our villages are getting a certain basic minimum level of food. They're getting 35 kgs of rice at 1 rupee a kg. They're getting some, I think, 10 or 15 kgs of wheat at 2 rupees a kg. If we have, and this is costing us about 1.5% of GDP, the Food Security Act. Is that entitlement or is that empowerment? It's a good question. We can debate that. We think it's empowerment. Unless people know that they are not going to die of starvation, unless they are at least secure about being able to feed themselves and their families, we cannot ask them to think about skill. We cannot ask them to think about education. We cannot ask them to think about self-employment. There is a certain basic level of support that as a civilized society, as humane people, as people who care about the poor, that we have to provide. That's the basic minimum level of food security we are providing, but that then becomes the platform for a better life. And that is our thinking around empowerment, not entitlement. Now, because we are a pro-poor government, we are a pro-markets government. And make no mistake, when we say that we are a government dedicated to the poor, that doesn't mean we are a socialist or a communist government. And that is the false trade-off, the fallacy that people fall into. We are a pro-poor government, and that is why we are a pro-markets government. Because we all know that unless markets work properly, unless markets are well regulated, we are not going to be able to create the jobs, we are not going to be able to create the employment, we are not going to be able to create the wealth that is needed to take care of our poor and to be a strong nation. So we are a pro-markets government. And there is a whole vast set of reforms that we've unleashed to make our markets work better. And I'm not going to go into that in detail. I'll just touch on 3 or 4 that I think are particularly important, and then I'll stop, and then you can ask me questions. But let me tell you, when you think of pro-markets, what we have done. And just to give some historical context to it, if you really think about reforms in India and start with 1991, there have really been three massive reform efforts, or reform sort of waves, if you will. Reforms 1.0 were the liberalization reforms of 1991, when we opened up the economy, when the licensing regime was taken away, and when import duties and so on were reduced. That was reforms 1.0, and that was done in 1991 with the budget that Dr. Manmohan Singh introduced. That had a long genesis. There were a lot of people who'd worked on all of that, but it was in the budget of July 1991 where reforms 1.0 were unleashed. The second set of reforms was in the NDA-1 government with Prime Minister Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee from 99, 2000 and 2001. That was reforms 2.0, and a whole host of reforms were unleashed then, including, for instance, building out the Golden Highway, really enabling the new telecom policy, which led to the mobile revolution, the massive push as far as infrastructure is concerned, liberalization of the financial sector, introducing venture capital, reducing import duties. There were a whole host of reforms that were undertaken then, 99, 2000, 2001. Those are reforms 2.0. But ladies and gentlemen, what we've done in reforms 3.0 in 2014, 15 and 16, since this government came to power, reforms 3.0, is broader in scope and substance than either reforms 1.0 or 2.0. And of course, we'll get into it in detail, but I'll just give you the 4 or 5 major aspects of these reform efforts. But reforms 3.0, because they are still in the pipeline and are working through the system, we still don't have a full sense of how dramatic and how game-changing they are. And Bill Gates famously said that the problem with the hype mongers is that you tend, because of the hype factor and so on, you tend to overestimate the short run and underestimate the long run. So what has happened is everybody's always, what is happening with reforms, what is happening with reforms, a lot of talk, a lot of stuff being written about it. The reality is, if you actually look at what's going to happen in the long term, it's going to be tectonic as far as the Indian economy is concerned, the market side of the Indian economy is concerned. And I'll knock off 5, and then I'll sit down and you can ask me questions. Number 1 is what we have done in terms of the formalization of the Indian economy. And that includes demonetization, GST, and a variety of other things which I can get into, digital payments, etc. The formalization of the Indian economy. Number 2 is what we have done as far as public finances are concerned. This includes what we've been doing in taxes, what we've been doing in terms of sharing with the states, and a whole host of other things. Obviously reducing the fiscal deficit and so on. So the reform of public finances, the changes in public finances. Number 3, what we have done as far as the social security platform is concerned, direct benefits transfer to people so that much more efficiently we can get their benefits to them. That's number 3, the social security platform. Number 4 is what we are doing as far as public infrastructure is concerned. Roads, highways, railways, aviation, get into it in exquisite detail. But as far as infrastructure is concerned, incredible gargantuan changes are going through the pipeline. And you can see that in many, many numbers that are now coming forward. And then number 5 is what we are doing for innovation and the startup ecosystem and venture capital and private equity and the capital markets and the whole financing of our growth. So there also, capital market financing, private equity financing, venture capital financing, all the things that we're doing with the innovation ecosystem, the entrepreneurial ecosystem, I think is absolutely groundbreaking. So those are just 5. I can list another 5 that are perhaps even equally important, such as what we've done in agriculture with the Fasal Bima Yojana, the crop insurance, irrigation, village economy. Those are also extraordinarily important. I can talk about Make in India and Skill India, which are also equally very, very important. So there's a host of different things that we've done as far as the economy is concerned, that as far as reforms are concerned, add up to reforms 3.0, which are much broader, much deeper than anything that's ever been done before in India. And we've done that in 3 years. So I'm going to stop now. I'm sure you all have, hopefully, questions you want to ask. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you very much, sir. And this oration of yours fits in very well in the context of what has been discussed here, particularly this morning on trends in globalization and how when most countries are actually becoming politically looking more inward. Here is one country which is insisting that good economics actually can make good politics. And to be pro-poor also means being pro-markets. And pro-markets means undertaking a whole slew of reforms which you've counted up on your fingertips. Now you've also given a carte blanche to everyone to grill you and ask you all kinds of questions, and they are going to take liberties with this. But first of all, there's one question.
Please don't hold anything back.
Let me initiate, sir. You've spoken about the big infrastructure push. And infrastructure has had serious problems in India. The PPP models, the private-public partnership models, had all but failed until I think this government took some very bold steps and went in, especially in the matter of roads, with the hybrid annuity models, which are very innovative and have started getting investments back into some major infrastructure projects. That is one part of it. But the second issue which still remains is the stressed balance sheets of banks, which has become a major concern. What is the thinking on addressing the whole issue of the NPAs, which the large public sector banks are saddled with at this point of time? How do you see this issue getting resolved? Because if there is not going to be sufficient lending flowing into the market, where will investments come from?
You've touched on a very important issue, one of the key issues that is afflicting the economy right now. An issue that I have personally a lot of experience in because I dealt with that firsthand when I was in the Ministry of Finance. And it is something that as a government we have been working on for 3 years. Now there are several parts to this issue. The first is that we have to relieve the pressure on the NPAs by ensuring that many of the reasons why projects stalled and led to NPAs are addressed. So highways you talked about, many road projects were stalled because of not getting land, not getting environmental clearances and so on. And as a result of that, because those road projects couldn't move forward, you couldn't start generating tolls and cash flow from those road projects. That obviously meant that the developers that were developing those projects got into financial trouble. And of course, because developers got into trouble, banks got into trouble. So there was a chain there of causation that started to create these problems. Now, as I said, one of the key things we've tried to do is to ensure that those road projects, those power projects which were suffering because of lack of gas or lack of coal, some of the real estate projects that were dealing with environmental issues, all of those reasons why projects had stalled were addressed as quickly as possible. And if you've seen the latest data put out by CMIE, the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, you'll see that the number of stalled projects or delayed projects has been coming down quarter after quarter after quarter, and that is relieving a lot of pressure on the developers of these projects and banks as well. So that's number one, which is to get to the root cause of these NPAs, number one. Number two, we had to make sure that we had the mechanisms in place to be able to move certain equity owners out of these projects. Because if you got into a situation where you as the equity owner could not support the project anymore, then there had to be mechanisms by which the banks or stressed asset companies could actually replace the owners of those assets, put in new capital, put in new owners and so on. That also we have put in place through a variety of mechanisms, starting with S4A, which was the Stressed Assets Resolution Mechanism, strategic debt restructuring. These are all mechanisms that RBI put into place. And then most importantly, last year I myself passed that legislation in Parliament, which was the bankruptcy legislation that we've introduced, a tectonic shift in India's economic landscape, because we've now basically changed the balance of power between the creditors and the equity owners. And so now if you default on your credit, on your debt, the creditors can come in and replace the equity owners of those assets, and take over those assets. So we've immeasurably strengthened the hands of the creditors relative to the equity owners when it comes to taking over these assets, pumping in fresh capital, and managing in a far better way. So that's the second aspect in which we've tried to address the NPA problem. The third way in which we've tried to address the NPA problem is to structurally go in and change the public sector banks themselves. Because the public sector banks in the previous government engaged in, shall we call it, irresponsible lending. And as a result of that, they made a lot of loans to people they shouldn't have. If we didn't address that, then we would get the next wave of NPAs again. So we made a whole host of changes to our banks, which was under what was called the Indradhanush reforms package, which I myself put together and was implementing when I was in the finance ministry. And there we made a number of structural changes to the way banks are organized, the way in which they are governed, in the recapitalization of the banks. We put in the Bank Board Bureau to be able to monitor and supervise these banks. And that's the third major thing we've done to address the NPAs. A lot of NPAs are being resolved. So that's item number 3. Item number 4, as far as NPAs are concerned, is that we do have a situation as far as the NPAs are concerned, where really it's 30 or 40 accounts that are really responsible for the vast majority of these NPAs. And there are some very difficult and complicated negotiations going on. Some we've seen, for example, with SR selling its refinery to Rosneft, where there are some very complicated, both legal and financial negotiations that are required to be able to find a way of dealing with those stressed assets, replacing management, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really what we are in the process of doing right now, which is the workout process. If you go back to what happened, for example, post-2008 financial crisis, and you look at what happened with TARP, or you look at what Sweden went through when it went through its NPA crisis, the workout phase, which is what we are in right now because we put the mechanisms in place, the workout phase was not completed in one day. It took years for Sweden. It took years for America to deal with its stressed assets problem. That's the workout phase that we are in right now. So if you keep saying, well, the NPA problem has not been resolved. No, the NPA, we put the mechanisms in place to deal with the NPA issue. Now we are going through the workout phase. There are 30 or 40 accounts where we are working through them. There have been a lot of examples of workouts. As I said, you can look at the SR oil refinery. You can look at what JP has had to do with its assets. You can look at many other assets which have been disposed of. We now have a whole host of stressed assets, special situation funds that have been created that are in the midst of this workout phase right now. But there is no magic wand that we can wave as far as NPAs are concerned, and it goes away. It's a long and lengthy workout process that we are engaged in right now. And then finally, I will correct one other misimpression that is out there, which says that there's no lending going on. That's not true. Certainly on the retail and small business side, credit growth has been very strong. It's been almost running at 15 or 20%. And what has not been happening is project financing. And there are two reasons for that. A, because projects are stalled, and so we are not really doing a lot of new projects. That's why those project financing numbers are down. And two, a lot of project financing is not being done by the banks anymore. It's being done by issuing bonds, masala bonds, and so on and so forth. So if credit growth is down, it's a very simplistic view to then say, well, the economy will stall. The economy will not stall because obviously credit growth in retail and small and medium business is strong, and those who are good projects that need to be financed, for example, in renewables or in aviation and so on, they are finding financing without any trouble at all. In fact, the world is awash in capital. So I wouldn't come to that conclusion. Sorry for that long answer. You asked a big question on NPA, so it did require a comprehensive response.
A very patient, very comprehensive response. Thank you very much. The floor is now open. Yes, Sadan. Please introduce yourselves and ask a question.
Sadanand Dhume from the American Enterprise Institute and the Wall Street Journal. Jayant, thank you for that wonderful sort of presentation. I'm going to ask you, you asked us to hurl rocks. I won't take that literally, but I'm going to ask you two questions. The first is that your characterization of reform as 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. One could argue that in reforms 1.0 and 2.0, it was essentially a contest. It was essentially a group of reformers who were rolling back the frontiers of the state in the economic life of India. That was certainly true of the 91 reforms. It was also true of the Vajpayee era reforms. But the things you listed here, demonetization, formalization, public finances, social security, public infrastructure, and so on, I would argue are more about building state capacity, and they're certainly not about removing the heavy hand of government from the economy. So that's the first question. The second is the sort of distinction you made between entitlement and empowerment, which, for obvious reasons is very dear to my heart. But it seems to me that there's a sort of, a bit of a sleight of hand going on over here. Because if, let's say, there had been a Congress government that was, giving people gas cylinders and giving people toilets, we would all have called it entitlements. And empowerment, at least as it was traditionally understood, was things like building a road, providing better schools. So what we seem to have is, on the one hand, this sort of, this idea that there's a philosophical distinction between entitlement and empowerment, but on the other hand, all it sort of seems to me to be is calling a bunch of entitlements empowerment.
No, I think those are two great questions. Let me take on both of them. First, with respect to state capacity versus markets, right? You're exactly right to say that there is a line that separates, the economic role of the state and then the role of markets. That obviously is a line we all understand it very well. Now, first thing we have to do is we also have to make sure that the state, whatever is within the state's remit in terms of delivery of public goods, or in the manner in which it regulates markets, it does that as efficiently and as effectively as possible. So it's not the dead hand of the state, but a light hand of the state, which we all recognize is required in any market-driven economy. So you're absolutely right. There's been a tremendous amount of work with respect to making sure that state capacity is built up and the state works effectively. But, and I would argue, that we've also done a number of things to unleash markets further. Just an example of that is what we've done in aviation, and I'll list 2 or 3 others, but let me talk about aviation first and foremost. In aviation, we today have the most open market in the world. We allow 100% FDI in airlines, airports, cargo, virtually the only country in the world that is as open, as liberal as India in terms of FDI. And we've also in many other places gotten rid of a lot of FDI constraints. I myself passed 49% FDI in insurance in Parliament, as you know. That's an example of where we have reeled back the state and produced more market-determined outcomes. So, and in aviation, of course, the UDAN scheme that we've done just now, regional connectivity scheme, was all about unleashing markets. It was not about getting Air India to fly to those locations, which previously were the kinds of ways in which these regional connectivity schemes were attempted and which failed, frankly, because Vayudut was a company that the Indian government had started to fly to smaller locations. Vayudut went bankrupt. So this time we have 5 regional airlines that have been created to fly to these smaller markets, as opposed to just having the government try and do it. So in aviation, we clearly are showing that we are working towards market-determined outcomes. Air India's market share, by the way, has now come down to 15%. 85% of capacity in the aviation market is with private sector players. So clearly, if you look at aviation as an example, in aviation, the line between the state and the market, the state has retreated and the market has really taken over. Similarly, in telecom, if you look at the policies that we've implemented in telecom, the auctioning of spectrum, we've released a lot of spectrum from defense. We made that available for our telecom providers. We made it possible for a very aggressive entrant like Jio to come in, invest some $30–40 billion in capacity, and really make it possible for data to be delivered to your phone at a price that is unequaled anywhere in the world. Did you know that the highest data in absolute terms, not in relative terms, the highest amount of data consumption in the world is in India right now? And that is because bandwidth is being provided by private sector players, not by the government. The government's completely irrelevant in this market. We've just regulated these markets appropriately, and as a result of that, markets have taken over and are delivering, bandwidth, data, telecom services at unimaginably low prices. Another example in financial services. In the last 10 years, the UPA government gave 0 banking licenses. 0. The previous government, the NDA government, had given 2 banking licenses, one to IndusInd Bank and one to Kotak Mahindra Bank. That's it. In our government, we gave 11 payment bank licenses. And we made it possible now for you to get a banking license on tap. So we massively opened up banking. The state has gone back, retreated, and the markets are taking over as far as banking is concerned. You look at digital payments, we've just created the India Stack, which is a set of open standards and protocols that the government has issued, on which we have massive innovation going on as far as financial technologies are concerned. We've opened up APMC, which was the agricultural price marketing control, where all vegetable produce, all produce had to go to government-controlled bazaars where they had to sell. We've dismantled that. So now we've said anybody can buy and sell any which way they want to. We've opened up FDI in retail. So I can go on and on and on like this in many, many such examples and show you where the regulations have become simpler and simpler and simpler, where we've made it possible for markets to really take off. So I think in Reforms 3.0, there's been a tremendous push as far as the growth and the involvement of markets are concerned, and those are there in front of you. So that's the state versus market discussion. Now you raised an equally interesting discussion around entitlement versus empowerment. It's an interesting, at some level, semantic question, which is, would you bucket a toilet as entitlement or as empowerment? And there, as they say, beauty lies in the eye of the beholder. At some level, it is going to be subjective. I would say the way I would draw that line, and I'm just thinking on my feet here right now, I would distinguish between entitlement and empowerment in the following manner, which is that empowerment is one in which if the state provides a product or a service, whether it's public health, whether it's education, whether it's skill development, whether it is a toilet or a gas stove, if beyond the functional benefits, there are massive positive externalities. If there are massive positive externalities where not only can you cook something on a stove, but you also have a tremendous knock-on effect on many other aspects of somebody's life, to my mind, that is more empowerment and less entitlement. Now, it gets tricky. If somebody gives you a refrigerator, is that entitlement or is that empowerment? You could say, well, they're getting cold water, but maybe because their food is not spoiling, it has a public health impact. I think there is conceptually, in my mind, it's a gray area, I agree, but conceptually, in my mind, there's a difference between a refrigerator and a stove. We are not giving refrigerators, we're giving stoves because of the public health impact, the time required to actually go out and get fuel wood, etc. I think the associated ancillary positive externalities associated with the stove are far higher than that of a refrigerator. But there is no red line that you can say such and such is empowerment, such and such is entitlement. Similarly, if you talk about a toilet and you talk about the public health impact, the social impact, what it means for women, etc., I think it's fundamentally different when you give somebody a toilet versus when you give a lady a Mangal Sutra or a grinder, a mixie. In Tamil Nadu, they've given people mixies, grinders, food processing machines. They've given people necklaces. Those are the kinds of things that governments have done. I think you give somebody a necklace or a food processing machine, a grinder, a waste, that type of machine, that to me feels more like entitlement and less like empowerment. What about a bicycle? Is a bicycle an empowerment or an entitlement? I think a bicycle is actually empowerment because it enables mobility, allows you to get around, etc., etc. And so there is a class of goods and services like health, like education, like skills, like gas stoves, like food to a certain level, that I think fall in the empowerment category. I admit that this is not something where you have a red line that you can draw. I think it's a judgmental issue. Its beauty lies in the eye of the beholder. But I can tell you that we philosophically in government spend a lot of time thinking through whether it is empowerment or entitlement. So we do recognize that there is a line. We want to stay well on this side of the line, not get onto that side of the line. So it's not something where I can give you, as an engineer, I can't give you a closed form solution on it. But there is a sense where it's more on this camp and less on that camp.
Okay, I'm now going to collect some questions because there have been a number of raised hands. Meher, I know you're holding a mic, but precedence goes to the lady here first. Your question.
Hi, my name is Olga Mostinskaya from Russia. I have a question. My country is striving to achieve development, and so is India. But we've seen in the recent years, post the World War II...
Sorry, you're from Sweden?
No, I'm from Russia.
Oh, you're from Russia.
Russia, Rusi Hindi Pai Pai. So Russia is struggling to achieve development, and so is India. But we've seen on the example of many countries that have tried and failed since the World War II that this is a difficult endeavor. Actually, in fact, the only group of countries that was able to successfully achieve development were countries from Northeast Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and now China. And their path towards development, towards the group of developed countries, was through industrial development. Can you skip this stage? Because when one looks at India policies, one gets an impression that you're trying to leapfrog the industrial development and base your growth on services. But is growth equivalent to development? And can you skip industrial development?
I mean, you've asked me a question that fills libraries. So I'll try and give you a succinct answer. I mean, of course, you're exactly right that it is the countries of North Asia that have gotten to OECD status. So first of all, I'll distinguish between middle income and high income. There are a lot of middle income countries in the world, which are like Mexico and even Indonesia to an extent, Vietnam, many countries in South America like Brazil, which is quite a large country as well, which have reached middle income status.
But this is not what you want, right?
So hear me out. So I'm saying we have to go in steps. For India to aspire to become Switzerland at this stage is not practical or realistic. We need to start to think about middle income status first, which means that we go from about $1,700 of GDP per capita to getting to $3,000 to $5,000 GDP per capita. And that really is where we are thinking right now, the next 10, 15, 20 years. Can we become a middle income country? For us, if we sustain growth for the next 20 years at 7 to 8%, only then will we become a middle income country. So that's my lifetime as far as I'm concerned. I'll let the next generation worry about high income. So I'm worrying about middle income right now. So is it possible for us to reach middle income status like a Mexico? Absolutely. In fact, we have many states in India that I would argue today are effectively middle income country. For example, Gujarat, for example, Goa, for example, Kerala. These are middle income countries. I have traveled all over the world. When I go to Kerala, Gujarat, Goa, states like that, Sikkim, I feel like as far as all of the basic life amenities are concerned and people's livelihoods are concerned, we are at middle income status. Now the question for us is, can we take India's hinterland, Jharkhand from where I come, Chhattisgarh, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and really bring them up to middle income status? That is how we need to prioritize and focus our efforts. And so that really is what we need to think about. So in that sense, Russia's problems and India's problems are completely different. Our problems are middle income status, elimination of poverty, first and foremost. Now, in that journey, the conventional wisdom is that it has to happen through industrialization. So you got to have big factories employing a lot of people, go to Shenzhen, you got to build Shenzhens. That's the conventional wisdom. I don't agree with that. And I've written a number of articles on where I think India's development model has to fundamentally be different. And I think just like we had mass manufacturing, we in India are pioneering a new development model, much more frugal, much more sustainable, and that is oriented around mass services, not mass manufacturing. And examples of that are what we're doing in digital financial inclusion and in digital financial technologies, the whole India stack. To the extent that you've looked and studied that whole area, you should please do that. We've done that in telecom. We are going to be doing it in aviation, where we are going to take services, chunk it up, come up with new pricing models, affordable innovation, so that we can deliver a bank account at a price that nobody else in the world can match. We can deliver life insurance, term life insurance at a price. Term life insurance in India, we are selling at 330 rupees a year, $6 to $7 a year. We are selling you 2 lakhs, that's about $30,000 worth of life insurance to our population. Nobody in the world can match those numbers because we have developed the ability to deliver mass services. And that becomes the virtuous growth cycle for us. So that has to be India's development model. We cannot replicate what China has done. We will have to forge our own development model, and I think we are.
Sanjeev.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Sanjeev Aluwale from ORF. So I'd like to take you back to the vision that you propounded right in the beginning of trying to do something about poverty and using market instruments to achieve poverty dilution.
I didn't say that. Please be clear.
Okay.
Please be clear. What I said was we are a pro-poor government,
Yes.
which requires state capacity to be able to address the needs of those in extreme poverty.
Yes. Yes.
And to do that, the government has to have the resources. If our markets don't function well, if people don't pay their taxes, if our tax to GDP does not go up from 16, 17% consolidated to 21, 22%, if we don't formalize our economy, we as a government are not going to have the resources to run a social security platform to build toilets.
Quite right.
So markets, and if markets function well, we build up prosperity. That prosperity enables us to make sure that we can end extreme poverty. That's the mechanism.
Yeah, my question was slightly different, sir. What I meant was, for example, social protection can either be achieved by handing out grants, like the British used to in the old days, or by bringing in social insurance, as your government has done very nicely. So my question is that it's very important not only that people become less poor, but that they feel less poor, right? And one of the ways of making people feel less poor is actually by transparently sharing who the beneficiaries of the various social protection and poverty dilution schemes are, and whether or not, you know, the beneficiaries are broadly in the same direction as the existing cultural and regional and religious diversity of India. And one can use big data to do that. But one doesn't see enough of this happening. Do you think it's a good idea that this should be explored further, sir?
You know, I'm not sure I understand your question. Can you in one line summarize it? What is your question?
Sir, for example, I'd like to know how many Muslims have availed of social insurance?
As you know, there is absolutely no discrimination between any citizen coming and applying for any of these social security benefits. We have got 100% coverage as far as bank accounts are concerned, and that includes all sections of society. Once you have a bank account, you can go and get the life insurance. You can go and work in the Narega program and get your payment digitally into your bank account, etc. Aadhaar does not discriminate in any way between an individual from one section of society versus an individual from another section of society. So again, Aadhaar, you get Aadhaar, and that enables you to do a whole host of things. Whether it's skills or education, etc., to the best of my knowledge, there is no way that it is lawful to discriminate between one section of society and another section of society. So, as I said, sabka saath, sabka vikas. We want everyone to benefit. And we are determined to make sure that we can extend the benefits to everyone. Toilets are being built for every house in the village. I mean, I spend a lot of time in those villages, and I can tell you, we're building to declare I have two districts in my constituency, Hazaribagh and Ramgarh. We have declared Ramgarh ODF, open defecation free, which means that every single household of every section of society now has access to a toilet or actually has a toilet. In the slums, not everybody has a toilet, the space isn't there. So they're public toilets, so it's access to a toilet. But every family has access to a toilet now. So that's how we look at it. You know, everybody has to get the benefits that the government provides. We are not making those distinctions at all.
Okay, Mihir, you've been very patient. It's now your turn. And then one last question to Ambassador Lata.
So Mihir, I'm sure, has not a rock but a boulder.
Thank you, Minister. As always, a very sort of clear exposition. I actually wanted to ask a question that may not apply to the ministry you're in, but is something that I think a lot of us from the outside have felt concerned about since this government came in. The last government ran into corruption scandals, and this government has been very careful to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Unfortunately, one of the consequences of that has been, many people worry, that policy is made without consulting stakeholders. And there is concern that bureaucrats and ministers are frequently coming up with policies that affect sectors, and because of the fear of being seen as too close to industry, aren't talking to the companies that are affected in those sectors. Now, I know, for example, that this has not been the case with the low-cost aviation scheme, but this is a sense that has spread across Indian industry in general. Is there some way in which you see the government being able to break out the political trap of either being accused of being too close to industry or failing to take stakeholders' concerns on board?
To be honest, I have not heard that criticism. And the principles of transparency and accountability that we follow imply that any policy or any draft legislation that we have goes through many rounds of consultation, vetting, input, media criticism, etc. And therefore, all major policies, I think, have been subjected to that kind of scrutiny and to those kinds of inputs. And of course, people are free to send us letters and write notes and write op-eds in the newspapers and so on and so forth. And I can tell you for a fact that we read everything, and at the senior most levels, all good advice is listened to and considered and evaluated for suitability. So in that sense, I think we are an extremely open and transparent government. We make it very clear how we are thinking about issues. The senior members of the government are in continuous interaction with the media, like we are doing right now, and we try to be as transparent about policies as possible.
Last question.
Minister, thank you for a very comprehensive survey of the reform process as it now exists. I have two questions. One is, you talked about long-term tectonic transformation of the Indian economy. What would you say would be the sort of more or less minimum time frame in which we can expect to see some effects of this tectonic transformation? My second question is on the aviation sector. The growth in Indian aviation domestically is impressive. The infrastructure developments in airports, new routes, and numbers of airlines operating is also impressive. My question is more on our international airline image. Why not we stop supporting and subsidizing Air India and allow the private sector airlines, which have done brilliantly in the domestic market, to then establish themselves as the flagship Indian international carrier as well? Thank you.
So with respect to tectonic shifts, I think there have been already many tectonic shifts that are impacting everyone. I think you probably had to deal with some of that when you went through demonetization. So I think it's affecting the life of every single Indian in many ways. Obviously, when you look at the macroeconomic stability that we are seeing right now, the low inflation rates, the lower interest rates, the strength of the rupee, the fast GDP growth, where our capital markets are right now. I mean, all of that is evidence of the fact that these steps that we have taken have already shown up in terms of things like FDI inflows and so on. Obviously, on July 1st, when we implement GST, you'll find your life has changed completely, and that will be another mini tectonic shift. So in that sense, I can tell you that people are experiencing it, and that's the 95%, 99% of India that I talk about. You know, when a toilet is built in your house or you have a bank account for the first time, you're very appreciative of what the government has done, and it's reflected obviously in the election results as well. So I think all of this is really flowing through the system and has been flowing through the system over the last 2 or 3 years. Now, with respect to aviation, your question about international carriers, our international carrier, our private carriers, whether it's Indigo, SpiceJet, GoAir, and of course Jet Airways, are free to fly internationally anywhere they want to. So it's not as if we are restricting them in any way. Jet Airways is flying around the world already, for example. And you'd be surprised to know that 2/3 of India's international aviation market, 2/3, is controlled by foreign carriers. So of the tickets booked in India to fly to New York or to fly to Shanghai or to fly to Singapore, 2/3 of those tickets are sold to international carriers. And I talked about an open market. I don't think that's the case anywhere else in the world, that 2/3 of our international flights or our international passengers leaving India, I'm not talking about people flying from London to Delhi. I'm talking about people flying from Delhi to London or Delhi anywhere else or Bangalore anywhere else. 2/3 of them are on international carriers. Lufthansa, British Airways, Emirates, Singapore Airlines, etc. That tells you how open we are. So it's not just a question of domestic carriers. Even for international carriers, our markets are wide open and they're taking full advantage of it. When it comes to Air India, we have a very robust transformation plan in place for Air India. We are going to make Air India a great global airline. It's going to compete with all the international carriers and hopefully be good enough, and we are striving for your business, that it can take share away from all these very, very formidable competitors.
Thank you, Minister. I think you've given this forum here lots of reason to cheer and the belief that the optimism which is so visible in the capital markets about the India growth story is not a misplaced optimism. There are some good, solid reasons, and you've been spelling out those reasons as to why India is, yes, holding out so much hope and promise for the rest of the world.
Yeah, as a finance person, I have to say that money talks, and they're putting their money where their mouth is.
So thank you very much for being here this afternoon, sir. Please join me in applauding the Minister for this excellent oration.